The joyful news, Uncle Abram's going to free us, and he'll send us where we choose. For the Jubilee is coming, don't just sniff it in the air. And 63 is the Jubilee for the people everywhere. And 63 is the Jubilee for the people everywhere.
War, civil war, came to the United States in the early morning darkness of April 12, 1861, with the firing of cannon. The place was Charleston, South Carolina. The target of the bombardment was Fort Sumter at the mouth of Charleston Harbor. The cause lay further back in American history. In the 85 years between the Declaration of Independence and Fort Sumter, the United States had grown in size, but had also grown apart. Northern states, with immigrant labor, large cities, and industry, differed markedly from their southern counterparts, with their vast plantations and hardscrabble farms supporting an agrarian lifestyle yoked to King Cotton. The contrast was greatest on the issue of slavery. Abolished in the North, it expanded in the South and became a source of bitter political disputes. In the South, the powerful planters saw to it that politicians supported the institution, while in the North, abolitionists warned against the immorality of slavery and saw a slave power conspiracy aiming to rule the land. Border war broke out in Kansas over whether the new territory would be slave or free. In 1859, a Kansas abolitionist named John Brown led a small group of whites and blacks in an unsuccessful raid on the federal arsenal and armory at Harper's Ferry. Even in Congress, the issue resulted in violence. For the white Southerners who supported slavery, the end came when Abraham Lincoln, who opposed the spread of the institution, was elected president in 1860. In the months immediately preceding Fort Sumter, South Carolina seceded from the Union, and 6 other states followed. They formed a government called a Confederacy. They elected Jefferson Davis of Mississippi their provisional president and demanded the withdrawal of United States forces from Southern soil. By April 1861, only a few federal military installations remained, including Fort Sumter. A small garrison of federal troops held on at the isolated fort. Finally, the newly inaugurated President Abraham Lincoln ordered fresh provisions shipped to Sumter. Rebels attacked the fort before it could be strengthened. The bombardment hardly reflected the carnage to come. The shelling lasted only a day and a half. On April 13th, the Union garrison surrendered. The only fatalities occurred almost absurdly. During a 100-round salute to the fallen Union flag, an accidental explosion caused the deaths of 2 Union artillerists. The salute was cut short. War was underway. By the time it was over, it had taken more American lives than any other war in history. President Lincoln called for volunteers and declared a naval blockade of the South. 4 more states withdrew from the Union, bringing to 11 the number of Confederate states, while 23 states remained loyal to the Union. Later in the war, Union loyalists in the western counties of Virginia seceded from that state to form the state of West Virginia. On July 21st, the war began in earnest near a Virginia railroad junction called Manassas, along the banks of a stream called Bull Run. Union troops initially held the advantage and were soon chasing the rebels down Matthew Hill. Rebel lines collapsed, and they fled in disorder up Henry Hill. There they regrouped, while Union forces rested at the foot of the hill. When the Federals again attacked, they met stiff resistance. Southern troops were inspired by the example of a newly arrived general, Thomas J. Jackson. One Southern commander pointed to Jackson and shouted, There stands Jackson like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians. Rally they did, gaining the advantage on Henry Hill. Victory became decisive when a fresh contingent of rebel troops attacked the Union flank on Chin Ridge. Stunned Northerners retreated to Washington with the realization that their Southern adversary was indeed formidable. Almost 900 Northern and Southern soldiers were killed, ending forever any chance that the conflict could be peacefully settled. In the Western theater of the war, command of the military district headquartered at Cairo, Illinois, was given to a little-known Union general, Ulysses S. Grant. He, in turn, gave the North what it needed most, a victory. Moving down the Tennessee River, Grant's amphibious forces defeated rebel defenders at Fort Henry in early February 1862. Greater triumph followed less than 2 weeks later at Fort Donelson on the Cumberland, where about 13,000 Confederates surrendered. In early August 1861, the Confederates defeated Union forces at Wilson's Creek in southwest Missouri, but their attempt to capitalize on the victory was frustrated by dissension among their leaders. The Battle of Pea Ridge in northwestern Arkansas decisively ended the presence of rebel forces in Missouri, putting that important border state securely in Union hands. The Confederates evacuated Nashville, abandoning much of Middle and West Tennessee to the Union, and regrouped in and around Corinth, Mississippi. Southern commanders, correctly believing they had a slight numerical advantage, decided to launch a surprise attack on Grant's army. Today, the battle is best known by the name it took from a nearby church, a name that means peace in Hebrew, Shiloh. Caught off guard, the Federals took heavy losses and retreated as rebels overran their positions. Union defenses held fast, though, at this sunken road. For 6 hours, Federal troops defended the position against repeated Southern infantry attacks and heavy artillery fire. Soldiers called it the Hornet's Nest. This defense gave Grant time to regroup in the rear. Heavily reinforced, he counterattacked. The rebels retreated to Corinth. The casualties stunned both sides. The battle was the bloodiest ever fought on American soil to that point. The country came away from Shiloh with the horrible realization that the war would end only when one side was brutally beaten. Shiloh slowed Grant's western offensive, but Confederate defeats along the strategically crucial Mississippi put the river increasingly into northern hands. Island number 10 fell. Union gunboats and rams crushed a Confederate fleet at Memphis. At the mouth of the Mississippi, New Orleans, the most populous city in the South, was taken by a naval force under David Farragut. Baton Rouge and Natchez surrendered. Soon, the Union controlled all of the Mississippi but Vicksburg and Port Hudson. The war spawned numerous coastal battles as the Union enforced its blockade of southern ports and harbors, an effort to deny the South its crucial foreign trade. One such battle was fought in April 1862 at Fort Pulaski, Georgia, situated to defend Savannah. Because of Fort Pulaski's location and its thick walls, Confederates regarded it as invincible. Older smoothbore cannon could not get within effective striking range. But the Union artillery brought to Pulaski included powerful new rifled cannon, which fired bullet-shaped shells. Within a mere 30 hours, these cannon had done such damage to Fort Pulaski's walls that the Confederate garrison surrendered. Today, projectiles remain lodged in Pulaski's walls, reminders of how changing military technology changed notions of so-called invincibility in the Civil War. Another advance in military technology was the development of ironclads, forerunners of modern battleships, like the gunboat Cairo, reconstructed in Vicksburg. Two legendary ironclads, the Monitor and the Merrimac, fought the most famous naval battle of the Civil War. On March 8, 1862, the scuttled Union warship Merrimac, raised by Confederates, rebuilt to include thick armor plating, and rechristened the Virginia, steamed into the waters of Hampton Roads off Norfolk, Virginia. In short order, the Confederate ironclad rammed and sank the sailing frigate Cumberland. The sailing frigate Congress ran aground and was burned. Only the ebbing tide and nightfall saved the grounded steam frigate Minnesota. Union leaders saw their entire fleet as threatened. In the course of a single day, wooden warships became forever obsolete. That evening, the first Union ironclad, the Monitor, arrived on the scene. Another revolutionary design, the Monitor was described by some as a tin can on a shingle. In a hard-fought battle the next day, each fired repeated shots into the other. After more than 4 hours, there was no clear winner, and the Merrimac withdrew. The Monitor did not follow, and the two ships never met again. Earlier in 1862, Union troops traveled by steamboat from the Washington area to the tip of the James York River Peninsula. There, the cautious Union commander, George McClellan, overestimating Southern strength because of fantastically incorrect information given him by Allan Pinkerton, the famous detective, held up the offensive. When the Federals advanced toward the Confederate capital at Richmond at the end of May, they were met by Southern forces at the Battle of Fair Oaks. Although indecisive, the battle forced rebel troops back toward Richmond, and their commander, General Joseph Johnston, was seriously wounded. He was replaced by a quiet Virginian, General Robert E. Lee. Lee called for reinforcements from Stonewall Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley. In a series of encounters called the 7 Days Battle, the rebels outmaneuvered the numerically stronger Union Army and forced it back into a fortified camp on the James River. While Union leaders reorganized, Lee moved. Daringly, he split his army and sent a force under Jackson to engage the army of General John Pope near Washington. When Lee learned that McClellan's force was being taken by water to unite with Pope's, he too went north to join Jackson's men. Northern and Southern forces clashed again at Manassas. In 3 days of bloody battle at the end of August, the Confederates won what was perhaps their greatest victory of the war, as Southern leaders dramatically outgeneraled the overconfident Union commander, Pope. Fierce fighting took place at an unfinished railroad cut. The afternoon of August 29th, Union troops tried to overwhelm the position, but could not dislodge the fierce rebels. Fighting became so intense that Confederates who ran out of ammunition threw rocks at their northern attackers. The next day, a Federal force under Fitz-John Porter surged against the rebels defending the unfinished railroad's deep cut. The Union attackers were decimated. Confederate reinforcements advanced, and the Union Army retreated into fortifications around Washington. For Lee, the victory was complete, perhaps his greatest. In the 3 months that he had been the Southern commander in Virginia, he had saved Richmond, recovered the state's northern counties, and pushed the Union Army back to Washington. Now Lee moved again, northward. He hoped to keep the fighting out of Virginia, allowing farmers to harvest their crops, and to win the decisive victory that many hoped would bring Great Britain to the side of the Confederacy. Thrusting into Maryland, Lee sent a force under Jackson to take the Federal stronghold at Harper's Ferry. Then, in an incredible stroke of luck, a Union soldier found 3 cigars wrapped in a dispatch from Lee that showed that his army was divided. Seizing the opportunity, the Union Army under McClellan moved to attack Lee's divided force. The two great armies met at a place one Union general described as pleasing and prosperous a landscape as can easily be imagined. A pastoral creek flowed nearby, the Antietam. The battle began at dawn on September 17th in Miller's cornfield with artillery and musket fire so intense it leveled stalks as closely as could have been done with a knife, according to Union General Joseph Hooker. Battle lines fought back and forth over the field for 3 hours, surging and ebbing around Dunkard Church, as both armies sought to hold the high ground around it. By mid-morning, the fighting shifted southward and centered on Confederate defenses at this sunken road. Almost 3 hours of battle resulted in more than 5,000 casualties and a new name for the place, Bloody Lane. Still farther southward, a few hundred Georgia riflemen held off Federals under General Ambrose Burnside from the heights above a bridge spanning Antietam Creek. After more than 3 hours, the Federals took the bridge, but delayed 2 hours in pursuing the rebels. When they finally did, Southern reinforcements from Harper's Ferry sent them back toward Antietam Creek. The Battle of Antietam was finished. It was the bloodiest single day of the war. Northern losses totaled more than 12,000, while Southern casualties reached almost 11,000. Antietam sent Lee retreating southward, while Great Britain withheld formal recognition of the Confederacy. President Lincoln, meanwhile, chose the occasion of the victory to issue a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It declared free on January 1st, 1863, all slaves in those areas of the seceded states not occupied by Union troops. The Civil War had now taken on two purposes: preserve the Union and put an end to slavery. After Antietam, Lincoln replaced McClellan with Burnside, who drove south and attacked the Confederates near Fredericksburg on December 13, 1862. In challenging the Confederates, Burnside sent wave after wave of Northern troops against Lee's defenses at Marye's Heights. Rebel troops standing on the sunken road behind this wall made a massacre of the repeated assaults. By nightfall, the North had suffered more than 12,000 casualties in these head-on assaults and in others against Lee's left flank. The South suffered fewer than half that many. The dispirited Federals withdrew to the other side of the Rappahannock River to wait out the winter. In the West, a Southern campaign to occupy Kentucky failed. After a defeat at Perryville, rebel forces withdrew into Tennessee. There, North and South clashed again at Murfreesboro on the last day of 1862 and on January 2nd of the new year. They battled to a bloody stalemate, and Confederate forces withdrew deeper into Middle Tennessee as winter closed in. On January 1st of 1863, Lincoln formally issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and soon the North began recruiting blacks into the Union military. Almost from the beginning of the war, many blacks sought to serve the Union war effort. At first, blacks were taken into the Northern Army and Navy with skepticism and given only menial roles, such as manual labor, cooking, and guard duty. But as the war progressed, black soldiers and sailors proved their worth and courage under fire. In engagements such as those at Port Hudson on the Mississippi and Battery Wagner in Charleston Harbor, blacks fought gallantly and suffered heavy casualties, earning their freedom on many bloody fields. The enlistment of blacks into the Union military began at an opportune time. The number of Northern volunteers was falling off, resulting in March of 1863 in the first draft law of the United States government. The poorly received Conscription Act produced few real recruits, but it did cause controversy and violence. In New York City, bloody draft riots in July 1863 produced more than 1,000 casualties as so-called peace Democrats attacked blacks, Republicans, and the property of both. In Virginia, combat resumed in 1863 on May 1st, when Confederates outmaneuvered a larger force of Federals at Chancellorsville. On the evening of May 2nd, Stonewall Jackson was accidentally shot by his own men while returning from a reconnaissance. Lee pressed on for 3 days more, forcing Union troops to withdraw, but he was devastated by the loss of Jackson, saying, "I have lost my right arm." The key to the war in the West was the Mississippi. After a series of unsuccessful amphibious operations, General Ulysses Grant devised a strategy to attack the Confederate stronghold at Vicksburg. In April, he marched his troops southward along the Louisiana side of the river, crossing with the aid of transports and gunboats, which had run past the Confederate guns at Vicksburg. His army marched first to Jackson, Mississippi, and then turned back toward the Mississippi and heavily fortified Vicksburg. After 2 unsuccessful attacks against Vicksburg's defenses, Grant reluctantly put the city under siege. Confederate soldiers and the citizens of Vicksburg were on half rations, but they refused to surrender. Grant did not relent. In the east, Lee invaded Pennsylvania. When he learned that a Union force was nearby, he quickly ordered his dispersed forces to gather near a strategic crossroads, a farming community and county seat named Gettysburg. There, an accidental encounter west of town led to a fierce struggle on July 1st. Union forces retreated through the streets of Gettysburg to Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge to take up defensive positions as reinforcements for both sides arrived. The Confederates failed to pursue and exploit an apparent advantage. The next day, on the Union left flank, Confederates hesitated until late afternoon to attack a poorly defended hill called Little Round Top. This commanding elevation at the southern end of Cemetery Ridge would later anchor the left of the Union defensive line, and both sides realized its importance. Union forces quickly occupied its heights. Vicious fighting occurred on the slopes of Little Round Top and nearby in a peach orchard, wheat field, and a maze of rocks called Devil's Den. In the fierce fighting, the Southerners threatened to turn this end of the Union line, but Little Round Top held. On the Union right, Lee's evening attack on the Federal positions on Culp's Hill and the East Cemetery Hill, though partially successful, could not be exploited to Confederate advantage. The third day began with a fight for possession of Culp's Hill, the Union forces finally driving Confederate troops off its slopes. Then came the most dramatic assault of the Civil War, Pickett's Charge. After a massive 2-hour cannonade by more than 200 cannon from both sides, about 12,000 Southern soldiers came onto this field. Carefully gathered into precise formations, they set out across the fields in front of Cemetery Ridge toward a copse of trees. They charged into the face of artillery and musket fire from the strong defenses at the center of the Union line. Union fire was fierce, the attack grandly futile. A few hundred Southern soldiers broke into the Union lines near the copse of trees and the infamous angle, but the Confederates were beaten back and retreated. The next day, only about 1 in 2 Confederates who made the charge reported for roll call. The battle was over. The Confederates retreated, the Southern cause and the Army of Northern Virginia crippled by the 3 days of fighting. Never again would Lee's army enjoy the battlefield supremacy it once had. For the Army of the Potomac, the costly victory at Gettysburg was a new beginning, giving it self-confidence and respect. The war was to continue for another 2 years, but the Battle of Gettysburg and the repulse of Pickett's charge were a turning point, the high water mark of the Confederacy. Vicksburg surrendered the day after Pickett's charge, virtually securing the Mississippi for the Union Navy. When Port Hudson fell 5 days later, the North gained control of the vital river and severed Texas, Arkansas, and much of Louisiana from the rest of the Confederacy. With the Union blockade tightening, the South was on the defensive. In September, the Confederates were encouraged by a victory at the Battle of Chickamauga. Here, Northern and Southern forces clashed about a dozen miles south of Chattanooga, Tennessee, just inside the Georgia border. In 3 days of sometimes confused fighting, much of it in tangled woods, Confederates gained the advantage. Finally, part of the Northern force retreated, and the Confederates threatened to turn their victory into a rout. But other Federals rallied under General George Thomas at Snodgrass Hill. At the day's end, his force too fell back, but his gallantry allowed for an orderly retreat into Chattanooga. With the Union Army trapped in Chattanooga, Confederate General Braxton Bragg decided not to attack and instead to lay siege. In late November, the two forces clashed again. On November 24th, Federals attacked Lookout Mountain, which, rising above the Tennessee River, anchored one end of the Confederate line. In what was later called the Battle Above the Clouds, General Joseph Hooker's men overran the well-positioned but heavily outnumbered Southern defenders. The next day, Thomas's Army of the Cumberland, still smarting from its defeat at Chickamauga, was sent to take the base of Missionary Ridge. Without orders, they continued their charge up the imposing hill. The cry of "Chickamauga, Chickamauga" shouted in the air, and they sent the rebels running. As the war ground on, prisoner of war camps on both sides filled. Supplies were often limited and conditions inhumane. One of the most famous of the camps at Andersonville, Georgia, is now preserved in memory of Civil War prisoners of war and as a tribute to all American prisoners of war. Today, the boundaries of Andersonville's 26-acre pine log stockade are marked by white poles. In a little more than 14 months, more than 45,000 Union troops were held captive here. Earthworks were built to guard them and protect against Union cavalry attempts to free them. Conditions were harsh. More than 12,000 soldiers died from malnutrition, disease, or exposure. In March of 1864, Lincoln appointed Grant commander of the armies. Grant aggressively set about bringing the war to a close. Moving south toward Richmond in May and early June, Union troops fought Lee's forces in a series of battles that produced heavy losses for both, especially the North. In the Battle of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and Cold Harbor, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia inflicted appalling casualties. But, unlike his predecessors, Grant pressed on. Unable to batter his way directly into Richmond, Grant bypassed it and Lee's strong defenses there, moving on to Petersburg, about 20 miles to the south. When frontal attacks failed, his force laid siege to the city, a rail center, and Richmond's link to the south. This forced Lee to stretch his outnumbered forces between the two cities, putting his army in a difficult position for a siege which was to be the war's longest. Grant's old command was given to General William Tecumseh Sherman. He struck south into Georgia in early May, and after a series of flanking actions and a futile head-on assault at Kennesaw Mountain, maneuvered the rebels back to the edge of Atlanta. After a series of battles around the city, the Confederates were forced to abandon it. The Federals occupied Atlanta on September 2nd. Soon after Lincoln's re-election, Sherman set out on his devastating march to the sea. He waged total war against Georgia. Burning a path 60 miles wide, his men sought to crush the flickering will of rebel resistance. They marched first to Savannah, which they reached shortly before Christmas. Meanwhile, the Confederate Army under Hood moved northward into Middle Tennessee in the hope of distracting Sherman from his march. Hood fought first at the Battle of Franklin, where his army suffered heavy losses in a charge that eclipsed Pickett's for gallantry and carnage, but he pressed on to Nashville. There he was decisively defeated by Union troops under Thomas, and for all practical purposes, the war in the West was at an end. In late January of 1865, Sherman's army headed north into the Carolinas. At about the same time, an early attempt to negotiate peace at the Hampton Roads Peace Conference failed. The war went on. Lee was appointed General-in-Chief of the Confederate armies on February 6th. Less than a month later, the Confederate Army in the Shenandoah Valley was destroyed by Union forces under General Philip Sheridan. Sheridan then led his cavalry veterans to Petersburg to reinforce Grant and give him a decided edge. Realizing that his situation was bleak, Lee launched an unsuccessful diversionary attack on Grant's lines at Fort Stedman. When Union infantry and cavalry under Sheridan won the Battle of Five Forks on April 1st and severed Petersburg's last rail link with the South and West, Lee's defense of Petersburg and Richmond became impossible. The next day, Grant attacked Lee's lines at Petersburg and broke through. The Confederate Army and government withdrew from Petersburg and Richmond. Grant pursued Lee's weary army westward. Finally, Lee's army was trapped near the pastoral community of Appomattox Courthouse. Early in the afternoon of April 9th, Palm Sunday, the two generals met in the home of Wilmer McLean, now reconstructed on its original site. The terms of surrender were generous. Officers were allowed to keep their sidearms. Men who owned horses and mules could take them home. All were to be allowed to return home undisturbed. By 3 o'clock, the Confederate surrender was complete, and Lee rode solemnly back to his remaining troops. Within 11 weeks, all other Confederate forces surrendered. The war was over. Peace could be restored. It was a peace marked by one last tragedy. On April 14th, a popular actor named John Wilkes Booth entered President Lincoln's private box at Ford's Theater and fired a bullet into his brain. The next morning, Lincoln died.